handle the truth.
Welcome to The Truth Hurts. This is your host, Sule Prince. Sule Prince.
Johnny, that really hurt.
Whether you like it or not, sometimes the truth hurts. The truth hurts. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Will set you free.
So welcome to another great episode of the Truth Hurts podcast. If this is your first time you are listening or watching it, please make sure to visit our resourceful website at the truthhurtspodcast.org. That is the truthhurtspodcast.org. We have a lot of informative videos, audios, and content for you. Also, please subscribe to our podcast and our YouTube channel. Your support is always appreciated. So let's get started. Today I have with me my great friend, Pastor Nadeau. Pastor Nadeau is the assistant pastor at Jarvis Street Baptist Church, located here in Toronto. He's also going to be starting his PhD this September at McMaster Divinity College. Brother, it's good to have you with us.
Oh, it's good to be here, Sule. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today.
Well, I've always wanted to have you on, and we have a good topic to talk about today. We're going to talk about the passage in Philippians chapter 4. Now, this is in times of crisis, in times of stress, anxiety, people usually jump to Philippians chapter 4, where it says, rejoice always, and again I say rejoice. And it just seems to be an appropriate passage for that. But let me ask you first, give us some historical context of this passage. Is this really what Paul is talking about in the book of Philippians?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I think it's important, you think of Philippians chapter 4, you're coming right at the end of a letter. Mm-hmm. So it's easy for us to open our Bibles and you go to a verse that you know. You may have remembered that verse, rejoice always. You think, don't be anxious about anything, which is just a couple verses later. And you think, okay, I know those verses. Those are the kinds of verses I want to go to in a time like this. And that's fine. But it's important to get some sort of historical background. Yes. To put it a little bit technically, I would say, why do you look at history? History, you could say history belongs to the prolegomena of theology. It just means that it's a first-order discipline. To say, I want to understand what the Apostle Paul is talking about in this letter, well, I need to do something in terms of understanding the historical background and the language of the letter and the whole context, the context of this passage in the letter, in the Pauline epistles, in the New Testament, and as Christians, we'd even say even in the context of the whole Scripture. Now, okay. We can't do everything, obviously, but maybe I took some notes. Maybe give me a couple minutes. I'll give some sort of historical background. Sure, and I think when we come around to the passage, it'll be clear. Okay, that's why we need to do some of this historical work.
Okay.
So Philippians, this is a prison epistle. You think of other epistles like Colossians or Ephesians or Philemon. These are called the so-called prison epistles. The traditional view is that they're all written in Rome, probably 5 years before Paul died. This is a Roman imprisonment. That's the view I take. I think it's the best view. Some people would argue, well, actually Philippians is written a decade earlier, maybe in Ephesus, in an Ephesian imprisonment. But this is probably written, so this is coming from Paul. He's in prison in Rome around 62 AD. The city of Philippi, still called Philippi today, had been founded centuries earlier. Some of your listeners may have heard of Philip of Macedonia, Philip II of Macedonia. He's the father of Alexander the Great. He founds the city, and it's a very significant city. If your listeners, if anyone knows anything about classical history, about 100 years before Paul had this letter written, this was where Mark Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius. Those were the leaders who were behind the assassination of Julius Caesar. Mm-hmm. This all happened in Philippi. It's on the Ignatian Way, and it's becomes a very significant city in the Roman Empire. It is Greek, and it's seen as Greek, and the language, well, it's the language everywhere at this time is Greek. But it has, and this is important as we come into Paul's letter and understanding the context, it has a very, it has a lot of Roman characteristics to it. So around the time Paul's writing, 85% of the inscriptions that you find in Philippi in the first century are Latin. 15% are Greek. Even though they speak Greek, it's very much full of Latin inscriptions. And we'll actually look at one. I want to read one for you because it's very important to get into the letter.
Okay.
Really interesting. And so while the Greek gods were worshipped in Philippi, and there were Oriental cults there, like Kurios cults, imperial worship, or the imperial cult, was sort of eclipsing those other kinds of worship. So the imperial cult is essentially the worship of the emperor as divine. We may think of a statement like Caesar is Lord. These kinds of ideas, maybe not put so simply, but you get this idea that the emperor is divine, or at least he's on some spectrum of divinity. So if you look into the New Testament, you read the book of Acts. It's Paul's second missionary journey. He's in Philippi. He meets this woman named Lydia. Well, this is where the church is founded. And you can read that. If you go back to the book of Acts in Acts 16, you could read all about that. But now Paul, again, this is later. He's writing to these Philippians. So why is he writing this letter? Just like when we write letters, we write them for a purpose or multiple purposes. Why does exactly what's the purpose? It's clear, one thing is clear. He's updating the Philippians as to his current situation. This is pretty clear. He's in prison. He's talking to them about his expectations that he may die, though he does hope to live on. He actually expects that he might live even more so than he might die. And in that sense, it's clear the letter is very personal. He's also giving them thanks for what appears to be a financial gift. A gift had been given to him. A guy named Epaphroditus had basically risked his life, Paul says, to give him this gift. And he's giving them thanks. And so if you have read through Philippians, you see there seems to be a lot more joy and happiness than in like Galatians or the Corinthian correspondence. And so this is a personal relationship, and it's clear that there's a lot of joy, though there are some issues. And Paul is taking the opportunity he mentions enemies. You mentioned Euodia and Syntyche. There's clearly some sort of disagreements going on in the church, and perhaps Judaizers or basically Jewish Christians. There's some sort of enemies around, and Paul's concerned about them as well. Okay. But all those things occasion the letter. And when we think about theme, and so you think, well, that's sort of the occasion for the letter, but what are the themes, or is there a main theme? It's hard to say. Like, we don't tend to have themes in our letters. Like if you're writing a letter to your church, you may have multiple ideas you're getting across. Yeah. It's probably the best way to look at it with Philippians. So it's clear that the term gospel, or euangelion, and particularly the advance of the gospel, it's kind of the backbone. You could probably say that about other letters, but it's in terms of the frequency of the term, it's used, I think, most frequently. But you get all sorts of ideas. You already quoted, like rejoice. I think you mentioned rejoice. Yeah. We get ideas of fellowship, of unity, of the mind and thinking. All of these are themes. They probably do revolve around that main theme of the gospel, but you can't press anyone too hard. Okay. And so this is sort of a background, the history. Why is Paul writing this letter? But I want to take just a second to look at the letter itself, because if we're going to understand the context for Philippians 4, we need to get into like the heart of the letter. Yeah. Which really you find in Philippians chapter 2. We don't have time to go through like chapter 1 or the whole letter, but I want to show you something which
Okay.
gives us an appreciation for this historical background. So
Okay.
I mentioned that Philippi is quite Roman. And so you have all these Roman inscriptions. Well, there's something that you have, which is sort of a phenomenon known in the empire at this time called the race of honors. In Latin, it's the cursus honorum. Think of it like the rat race. So you have aristocrats, elite people, they're climbing the social ladder. And as they climb the social ladder, they accumulate all sorts of titles for themselves, all their accomplishments. And if you were, important enough, this would be written down in an inscription. And we found these inscriptions. We can read them in Latin. And these inscriptions show us that this race of honors, there's a very particular way that they would be described, where someone's achievements would be listed from the least to greatest.
Okay.
And so you'd start, boom, and then you go up and up and up, and they would sort of publicly proclaim these people's achievements in that way. So this is one that we found in Philippi. I say we. It's not we, not me. This is one that the real scholars, found in Philippi. This is a guy named Publius Marius Valens. And you can see how it goes up. So it says Publius Marius Valens, son of Publius. So his father is important. From the tribe of Voltinia.
Okay.
The tribe's important. Honored with the decorations of a decurion. An aedile, that's an elected office of the Roman Republic. Decurion of Philippi, a priest of the divine Antonius Pius. And there's your emperor cult. Okay. So this is Emperor Antonius, one of the 5 great emperors in the Roman Empire, in that sort of golden age. Well, he's a priest. This guy's a priest. So there's the emperor cult. He's called a duumvir. That's a magistrate. So it's even higher. And then his last accolade, this guy Publius, is called a sponsor of the games. So the great games. So you have boom, boom, boom. All these titles go up and up and up. It was well known in the Roman Empire, and particularly in Philippi. It's a very important region. Now, when you read Paul's letter to the Philippians, and you come to the heart of the epistle in Philippians chapter 2, you find the same kind of thing that Paul does, this cursus honorum, but he flips it upside down when he starts talking about Jesus. So he mentions Jesus. You have that, it's called the so-called Christ hymn. I'm not convinced it's a hymn, but it doesn't matter. It's a poem, some sort of elevated prose, but you remember this guy Publius. You start from his name, and then you go up, up, up. Well, with Jesus, it's different. So Paul is talking about Jesus, and he says he's in the form of God. He's this big, right? He's in the very form of God, but did not regard equality with God something to be held on to. And he divested himself of this, took on the form of a slave. He was found in the form of humanity, in the form of a man. Humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, and even worse than that, death by crucifixion. And so a number of scholars think that, well, when the Philippians were hearing this letter read, just like you would hear perhaps read those inscriptions in terms of the Roman race of honors, they would recognize, well, this whole system, this whole rat race is being flipped upside down.
Yes.
Now, we know how Paul ends that Christ hymn, that so-called Christ hymn, with that great statement, every knee will bow, every tongue confess, Jesus Christ is Lord.
Yeah.
There are some people who would go so far as to say, well, yeah, Paul's reversing that entire Roman race of honors, that entire way of thinking, and if Caesar's at the top, I think N.T. Wright said something like, when Paul says Jesus Christ is Lord, he means that Caesar is not. And there's a lot of truth to that. Now, N.T. Wright goes a little far with some of his, he thinks Paul's everywhere hiding these critiques of the Roman Empire, but it's clearly true that there's all this background in the heart of the letter. Now, what bearing does that play when you get into Philippians 4? And right before this Christ hymn, Paul gives us, as he introduces it, so everything we've just said about the Roman nature of Philippi, this race of honors, well, right before this Christ hymn, we get what I believe is the main command of the letter. And it's hard to translate, but it's essentially something like, think the way Christ thought, or let the mind of Christ be in you.
Mm-hmm.
And this reverberates through the letter. So you get this example of Christ, flips the system upside down. Then Paul in chapter 3 gives his own example. Same thing, his own race of honors. He flips it upside down. Paul says, I had all those great titles, top marks in Pharisee school. I was the best of the best, better than everyone else. I'm, Benjamite, circumcised on the right day, everything like that.
Yeah, Jew of all Jews.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And he says all of it's nothing. And he actually says it's worth nothing compared to what he calls the all-surpassing greatness.
Mm-hmm.
That's the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And one of the main themes you do get in Philippians is this idea of the mind and the mindset and understanding and thinking. And this comes right, now you can go through Philippians 3, there's another guy, Epaphroditus, as well. But it comes right into chapter 4. When you get at the end, this, verses 4 through 9, you get all this language of the mind and thinking, or language which has to do with the mind, like anxiety, the things about which you are to think, God guarding your mind, having peace clear in the mind. You get all of this language about the mind. Background to all of that is this view, this is the Christian mind. It's having the mindset of Christ. And in the context of Philippians, it means, it means my mindset isn't one that the world has. Mm-hmm. So it isn't about trying to get ahead. It's about humility, because that was Christ's great virtue, his humility unto death. Remember, Paul flipped it upside down. And so, that's the Christian mind. So just before that, Paul says, consider others as more important than your own needs. And so you have this idea, everything's been reversed. And so the Christian mind is a mind that's been reversed in terms of the value structure. So when you come into Philippians 4 and you see this talk about anxiety, about how you are to think, about the peace of God guarding your mind, it's not just like Paul saying, suck it up and feel better. No, the reasoning behind this is because if you're in Christ, then the mind has been changed. And I actually think we can see it when you look at the text itself. So I know I took a long time.
No, that's extremely powerful.
There's a bunch of background for you, and I can pull up the text now myself.
Yeah, that was actually really, that's a whole sermon in itself right there. So that was a good background that you gave us on that topic. So while you look at the background at the text, this reverse idea of Christ and then coming down to be humble, do you think that would stand out more to the reader? Because we would say a person gets their bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD. That's how we would say it, right? To say a person has a PhD, master's, bachelor's, we don't do that.
Yeah.
If we went in that order, that would probably make people think, why would they do that? Why would they go in the reverse order? Do you think that going in this reverse order probably would have shocked the people that were listening?
Yes and no. Like in the sense that if they were conditioned in the same way we are, if they were conditioned by the culture around them, then yes, it's shocking. But and I guess I sort of just sped over this because I'm assuming most listeners know it well, but the end of that Christ hymn is so important because Paul doesn't end with Christ's death. He says, therefore he's been exalted. And so it's like what Paul's saying is this path of humility is the path through which we have understood the true greatness of Christ.
Okay.
And so, yes, it's counterintuitive. You're right. And it is shocking. This is a shocking message. It's the shocking message that Jesus preached and what he did. And this is the shocking message of Christianity, that the way in which the world sees is not the way in which God sees it. Paul says the same thing elsewhere in his letters. Outwardly, we're wasting away, and the eyes of the world we're weak, but inwardly we're being renewed day by day. So Paul can say these crazy things, like then when I'm weak is when I'm strong, because I know the power of God. It's perfected in my weakness. And so you get all of these reversals. But the point is that this isn't sort of wishful thinking on the part of Christians. I think it's Nietzsche who said, well, Christianity is a slave religion.
Mm-hmm.
So this to make slaves feel good because all your poverty is virtue. And Marx said, no, it's the opiate of the masses. So is it used by slaves or is it used by those in power? These secular thinkers can never agree, right?
Yeah.
One of them says it's for the low class. One of them says, no, it's for the high class.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is clear. Actually, it's for everyone. And it's not just wishful thinking. You don't get the resurrection in that Christendom, but it's implied. So it's because of this fact of the resurrection. And Paul says it in Philippians. He says, I'll strive to be like Christ, so somehow I too could be raised from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of the historical foundation of everything. It's sort of the verification of everything that Paul is talking about. I think it is shocking in a sense, but this is the very thing. This is the very thing which is at the heart of Paul's way of living now because he is imitating Christ.
Okay.
Actually,
so now, go ahead.
Here's a bit of trivia. What is the one thing that Paul teaches? I won't make you answer. What's the one thing that Paul teaches in every church? A lot of people will say it's justification by faith alone. The good old Reformation sort of articulation. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4:17, the thing he has taught in every church is his way of life in Christ. It is this new way of living in Christ. And of course, we're to understand that behind this new way of living is the very truth of that message about Christ's, his humility, his death, his resurrection. Same thing you get in Philippians 3:7-11, Philippians 2:5-11. But that's the thing that Paul says he's taught everywhere.
And so now bridge us into chapter 4.
So Paul does give in chapter 3 this example of his life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he also commends to the Philippians Timothy, and he's also commending their own Epaphroditus. But when you come into Philippians chapter 4, he's sort of doubling down. Follow my example.
Yes.
Follow my example. This is the beginning of chapter 4. Follow my example. And I believe that sort of connects this idea of this example. And so like Philippians 4, it's this ethical section of the letter. That's difficult because it does seem that there are some sort of disconnected statements. Mm-hmm. So you have Euodia and Syntyche.
Yes.
I believe that we're to understand this teaching section of the letter, everything we've talked about Christ and this sort of the foundation. When Paul's giving all these ethical commands, follow my example, rejoice, agree with one another, they come out of that. Okay. So they may not seem to flow so logically in terms of connect to each other, but they're all connected back to that teaching before.
Okay.
So the idea of unity clearly flows out of that. So if you have two people disagreeing, what's the problem? Why are they disagreeing? Would it not be the case that having the mind of Christ might mean that they can try to see past one another's differences? Mm-hmm. And humility, like in chapter 2, consider the needs of others as more important than your own. Could they not do that? Would that not bring them into some sort of agreement? Mm-hmm. It's funny. The German higher critics, those old sort of liberal theologians and biblical scholars were saying, actually, these two women are not real women. They represent Paul and Peter, and Pauline Christianity and Petrine Christianity. Okay. And so really, Paul is saying, hey, this is a Christian. Well, it's not Paul actually who's saying it at all. This is not Paul's letter. Actually, those people would have said this is a later letter. And it's Catholicizing in the sense that it's trying to make everyone come together when really they disagreed. Okay. It's pretty clear. These are two women in the church, and they're disagreeing, and Paul's commending them to agree with one another. And then you get this command. I'm looking at the text now. You come into 4, taking that section 4-9. It doesn't wholly stand on its own, but it's just a new ethical section. Mm-hmm. You do get this command to rejoice in the Lord, and that shoots you off into the whole kind of meat of those verses in 4 to 9. So